Hello and welcome to today's blog interview where we're here with Dr. Nathaniel McGregor. Nathan, what do you do for a living?
So I'm a lecturer at Stellenbosch University in the Department of Genetics. I focus on neuropsychiatric genetics, and essentially what I look for are the underlying genetic mechanisms associated with mental health disorders. As a lecturer in academia at a university, you also are required to teach. So I also teach human and advanced genetics modules at the university.
All right. And seeing as you work with students as a PI and as a researcher and a
lecturer.
There, thank you very much. Do you get time to do your own research, or do you sort of have to do your research through the students?
Yeah, I think it's probably a question that most lecturers at academic institutions in South Africa will have similar answers to.
Yeah.
But yeah, teaching is a very, very large component. I mean, anybody in academia, at least in South Africa, we thoroughly enjoy teaching and making sure that we're able to prepare the generation that comes after us in terms of like the work we do, but it does take up quite a lot of time. So you spend a lot of time doing admin, applying for grants, reviewing applications, making sure that dissertations and articles are getting to places they need to be. So there's a lot less time for your research. But the students that you do have in your research environment technically are pioneering or championing research projects that falls within your purview. So you are involved in research, but the hands-on applications tend to fall relatively far from what you're able to do because of time constraints, which is sad. I mean, all scientists would like to be able to do weight bench work, but it's not always practical, So I suppose we live vicariously through our students.
Yeah. And so when it comes to the students, you have the three sort of categories. You have honor students, master students, and PhD students.
Yeah.
What's the big difference between these three?
Do you mean in terms of the degrees themselves, or in terms of the actual students in such environment?
I meant more in terms of the degree itself, but you can tell me about the students.
So overseas, you don't really have honors degrees. I mean, there are programs in South Africa where you have 4-year undergraduate degrees and you can go straight into a master's. How we work, or at least within genetics here at Stellenbosch, you do technically quite a bit of theory in undergrad. So your honors year is essentially preparing you to be an actual scientist. So it's the first time you really get research projects and have to formulate hypotheses and aims and objectives of your own. And it's the first time you really actually get to a weight bench where you are doing work that you are or have complete agency over. Because it's essentially the first time you're doing it, you obviously need a lot of supervision, but that's your honors year. So I would say you go from a theoretical scientist to a scientist by the end of your honors year. Masters, as it implies, is are you able or have you mastered techniques associated with whatever research environment you're in? So a master's degree is not necessarily you trying to discover or invent something new, although if that happens, that's great. But it is a degree that allows or shows that you're able to actually take a research idea or hypothesis or aims and objectives, whether they are your own or your research groups, and actually apply some sort of experimental design, interpret the results and outputs from that, and formulate a discussion or appropriate conclusions from that. So you're able to master the techniques associated with experimental investigation, I would say.
Yeah.
A PhD is the highest qualification you can obtain within any particular field, but as the name implies, it's a doctorate of philosophy. It's essentially evidence or proof to show that you are capable of investigating and identifying novel or innovative things within your research environment, and essentially get science to a point where someone who comes after you is able to take over from where you left off. It also shows that you have sufficient experience, expertise, or knowledge or understanding of your particular research area to be able to investigate ideas or theories of your own. So if you're going to apply for research funding, especially if you're applying to a government agency where taxpayers' money is being used, we need to give it to someone who has proven they're able to actually do what they said they're going to do in the applications. And your doctorate is that proof or evidence, essentially.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So if I understand correctly, you would almost say that the line between not being a scientist and being a scientist lies in the honors when you start doing it, but actually a bit more in the masters.
Between honors and masters, but yeah, I would say you're a baby fish in a really big pool. I mean, so you've got exposure and experience, but I don't think you have the confidence to be able to run with a particular project of your own, which is why our MSc is within genetics anyway. I'll speak to areas I know. We don't have theory modules. You have to do a project, and it's by dissertation and a dissertation submission that you will be awarded your degree.
Yeah. And is the line between academic and scientist then after the PhD?
I think you as a master's student yourself, depending on which environment you're in, you focus less on the degrees being awarded from the point that you get to your master's and more about outputs and the work being produced. So I like to tell my students, especially when it comes to a PhD, that you shouldn't focus on the amount of work that needs to be done in order to gain said qualification, but you should be focusing on the research that you're doing and achieving the aims and objectives that you've set out. And eventually you'll get to a point where you've done this sufficiently enough to be awarded a degree for that particular body of work that you've produced. So that way you're a practicing scientist progressing in your career from masters moving forward, and the degrees will come. If you set out to get a PhD because you want the title, regardless of the interest or the drive or the innovation necessary to actually, complete the work for that doctorate, you're probably going to struggle a little bit more than someone who's interested in answering a question. If you have a question, you answer the question, and it's a question no one else has been able to answer, you deserve a doctorate for that. But if you would like a doctorate and then you are going to hopefully look for a question that needs answering, I think, or at least my opinion is that you're working in reverse, and it's trickier that way.
Would you recommend that people get a doctorate?
Well, it depends on what it is you ultimately would like to do. I mean, if your interest lies within industry or within a particular research environment where there are lots of questions, you don't necessarily need to investigate novel or innovative areas in order to answer them. Then I would say stay with the masters, because otherwise you're overqualified and it's going to be difficult to find a position. But if you would like to be the architect of your own particular career, apply for research funding of your own, have your own research group, and try and investigate questions that you have specifically, I would say your minimum base would be a doctorate. Not necessarily just because you require that as proof for funding applications, but it also is sort of a benchmark for you. You've answered questions that have not been answered before yourself. So you also need to make sure that you have the self-confidence necessary in order to move forward. With a PhD, you also are going to be responsible for other people and their degrees. You need to know enough or be comfortable enough with your level of understanding of things to say what you don't know, and also to be able to assist students in them trying to reach whatever level it is they're trying to get to.
Well, you said something interesting now. You said PhD is sort of the minimum base level. I always thought PhD was sort of the highest possible level that you can reach. So
it's the highest qualification you can obtain in your field, but it is not sort of the end point in terms of your trajectory of education. I mean, once you get to a doctorate, the idea behind it is that you know enough to understand what it is you don't know, or identify your knowledge deficits so that you're able to then explore avenues to train or teach yourself, or to get exposure or register for, courses or workshops or things that allows your understanding of a particular niche area to expand. So it's the minimum in terms of you are able to now start your own career with absolute agency and take responsibility for other people's education at a tertiary level as well. But I do think it is, despite being the highest qualification you can obtain, the start of you being an independent scientist. I think before your PhD, you might have independent projects, but you don't necessarily have independent research. After your PhD, if you do then assume an independent scientist position or research position, it's the minimum requirement for you to be able to fulfill that role, I would say, in my opinion.
You mentioned the scientist position and research position now. Is there a lot of overlap between scientists working in industry and scientists working in the academic research sectors?
I mean, it depends, I think, on the industry. I mean, if you're looking at diagnostics, if you're offering pre-existing diagnostic testing, then I think there is still a lot of science involved in making sure that you optimize and stay current in terms of the technologies that come out to make sure that these tests are more reliable, more accurate, higher sensitivity and specificity rates. But you won't necessarily be investigating, additional sort of genetic or diagnostic criteria for inclusion to make that test better. There are larger industry groups that have entire research wings, and they would do that. So it's entirely possible for you to work in industry and be a researcher or scientist. But yeah, industry, it has two branches. And within industry, your job is to provide a service based on the most current, most accurate, most specific platforms available. It's not necessarily to investigate, create, or discover new platforms for diagnostics that don't exist.
Yeah.
Although industry is a powerful partner, and if large enough and with the right financial backing, they do also have those kinds of wings.
Yeah. Now, I remember back when I was in high school, I would have a textbook and I'd see this picture of a scientist as someone wearing a lab coat with this little vial of green liquid.
Yeah, stock images.
It's stock images. So is that really what a scientist looks like? And is that really what a lab is like?
Well, it depends. Yeah, I mean, laboratories have individuals with lab coats. It's for protection. Most of the liquids are colorless, not really colored, but I mean, that's completely off the topic. But yeah, I mean, there are people with lab coats, but I would say the science that image sort of is associated with is often done by individuals behind a computer, looking at research, reading articles, going to conferences, engaging and networking with other scientists within the community. The lab work, think of it as a recipe. You have a protocol and you're following a protocol to produce the outputs. The actual science comes in the interpretation and discussion of what it is that you've actually gotten out of that experimental design. So yes, it's one component. It is an enjoyable component. But I would say it's probably the most structured, almost automated process. I'm not saying it's easy and that there isn't any challenges associated with it. But yeah, science is mostly critical thinking, and then the experimental part, the lab coat part, that's you trying to produce evidence that supports whatever critical thinking you've done. And you can think critically anyway. So there are scientists disheveled on skateboards, there are scientists in offices, there are those with waistcoats and lab coats, and there are those lying on beaches.
All shapes and colors and
you can think about science anyway, yeah.
Right. Now, in your own research, the neuropsychiatric research, is that primarily in silico behind a computer, like you said, or is that?
I mean, okay, so initially the problems we had was that because neuropsychiatric genetics requires very, very large data sets and large cohorts, that we just didn't have sufficient data. Now, with our technologies allowing for high throughput sequencing and genotyping, we have way more data than we are actually able to process or look at based on computing power, statistical sort of algorithms that are effective or will work, and also the nature and type of the data. I mean, we often have to look to machine learning now in order to actually get some sort of reasonable output that we can draw conclusions from. So yes, a large component of it now, I say, would be behind a computer, looking at in silico analysis, looking at predictive tools. But we also have progressed quite far in that particular area, and we have a lot of theories or ideas of candidate genetic variants or sort of genetic situations that require functional investigation to check whether our theories are actually manifesting in the way that we think. So I would say there's a large component of functional wet bench science work that is now a big factor or part of psychiatric research. But yeah, we do have a lot of data, and we aren't anywhere close to fully understanding how it all integrates in a biological or pathway-based model.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's also still a lot of interlocal work. So I would say they run in parallel.
Right. So Nathan, for a undergraduate that just finished and they're looking at what lab they want to go into, what do you think are the flags that they should look for?
Okay, for honors now.
For honors.
Well, like I said, honors is basically your introduction to weight bench work. So I think you should put less emphasis or focus on the particular niche environment you want to go to, like human, animal, or plant. All of those environments use similar molecular techniques, and those are the techniques that you ultimately will need in order to enter whatever niche you ultimately would like to be in. That said, it's also always great to get experimental weight bench experience in a research environment that is not the one that you're ultimately wanting to go into, because it means that you're bringing an understanding or experimental sort of applications that would not normally appear in those environments that could ultimately allow for innovative discovery. So for example, if you're in a plant or an animal genetic lab, techniques that they use there are probably not, well, I mean, we use a lot of similar techniques, but there could be applications or even sort of experimental work that you could use in a different way within a different research environment, so human genetics, that allows you to progress further than if you only understood experimental design for human application, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think for honors students, it doesn't really matter which particular research environment you go into, as long as you make full use of the learning opportunities available to you. It's going to open probably more doors than you thought could be opened. But yeah, I definitely don't think going to a plant lab when you're interested in human genetics is a deficit. I think it's probably an advantage. Yeah.
That's very inspiring, actually.
Yeah. I mean, science isn't. It's not designed for you to stay within your particular bubble, and the barriers of groups like microgenetics, biochem, those walls are all disappearing. We all use similar overlapping fundamentals these days, especially with complex disorders. So yeah, I would say even if you went to say biochemistry but was interested in genetics, that is going to probably have many advantages if you are interested in then applying for an MSc within a genetic environment. Yeah.
Nathan, thank you so much for talking to me today.
It's a pleasure, Chris.
It was a great
conversation.